In this video, we're going to be talking about the future of React Query, and specifically how React Query looks like and how it works in a server environment when it comes to server components and all the new modern React features. Now, I'm also very excited for this video because this is going to be a special video because we have a guest. I'm not going to be alone, which is great. We're going to be having Dominik Dorfmeister, otherwise known as TkDodo, joining us to talk about React Query. I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a moment, but essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a nice and relaxed conversation about React Query, looking at some code and specifically focusing on React Query on the server, which is going to be very exciting. I promise you're going to learn a lot of things, and I'm genuinely super excited to have the opportunity to talk with Dominik about all of this and to share this with you. So get ready, get excited. You're going to learn a lot in this video, and without further ado, let's begin. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm very excited. We have a very special video today, and of course we have a very special guest. We have here with us Dominik Dorfmeister, otherwise known as TkDodo, which you probably may know him. He's very prominent in the React community and ecosystem. So welcome, Dominik. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Cool. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm basically going to use this opportunity that I have to have a 15-20 minute conversation with Dominik, and we're going to be talking specifically about React Query, about the future of React Query and how React Query looks like on the server, right? With React now going towards the server with server components and all of that, right? We want to see how does React Query fare in that world? What does it look like? What are some things that we need to kind of keep in mind? Should we even use React Query? And just generally have a talk about React Query in general. Now, the reason we are here is because this video is sponsored by GitNation, and they are running the React Day Berlin 2024 conference. And that is a conference that is going to be in Berlin. Dominik is going to be one of the speakers, and I am also going to be attending personally. So in honor of that, we're doing this video to kind of raise awareness for that. If you're interested in joining the conference, there will be a link in the description. I have a special coupon code that you can use. And yeah, we have Dominik here. So Dominik, if you would please just give a few words of introduction about yourself for anyone that might not know you.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Dominik. I'm a software engineer from Vienna in Austria. And yeah, I work here as a front-end tech lead at Verity. And for the last 4 years or so, I've been maintaining the open source library React Query. And yeah, also now some other libraries of the TAN-stack. I'm also a little bit involved in the TAN-stack router that's being built by the amazing team. And yeah, I've started writing a blog, which I think some people might have read something of my writings. It's mostly about React Query and TypeScript and React, which is the thing I'm working on the most.
We've actually read one of your articles on the channel, actually, and I kind of made a video about it. Yeah, you have great articles, man, and it's very insightful into very specific topics, which I really like. I believe the one we read was the one about React Query with the context pattern. Sorry, with Zustand and the context pattern. That was the one.
Yep.
That's really cool. I really like the pattern, and you very much outlined why we would want to do that. Cool. Would you maybe share a bit what your talk is going to be at the conference?
Yeah, sure. So at React Day Berlin, I will be talking about React Query, the bad parts, which is something that I haven't talked about or written about before. And I want to, I know that React Query is a library that's usually loved by the community. I think it's a great library. And for this situation, I wanted to take a look at like the other side of things, because, you know, I think everything, without going too much into the talk already, but everything is a trade-off. As we know, whatever we choose must have some downsides. There is no free lunch. So we're going to look into what we're trading in when we're using React Query, and what are some situations where it might not be that well suited, but also hopefully going to debunk some myths about it where people think, oh, this is so bad about React Query, when in fact it might actually be good.
Mm-hmm. That actually sounds really interesting. I'm very excited to hear about it. I use React Query like pretty much as my default library. Awesome. Also because I work mainly in React Native. And so React Query is like the best that we have, right? We don't have yet all of that server cool stuff. So, you know, React Query is there, but I haven't really found any serious issues with it, but I would love to hear, because I'm sure that you have some, right? You're like the maintainer of it. Cool. So with that out of the way, let's now actually look at some code, which is really exciting. So essentially what I have here is I have kind of the code that is outlined in the official React Query docs. It is this page here, the advanced server rendering. So this is talking about how you want to actually use React Query with server rendering and all of that. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out, you guys. It's a great resource to have. But I just want to do like a quick walkthrough of the code, kind of get context for everyone here watching. And then I have some questions and we can just talk about it. So this is a Next.js application. So we're running all of the server components and all of the modern React features. And really everything kind of starts in this providers file. So we essentially have a client component that just does the traditional React query setup, which is create a query client and then passes it to the query client provider, which is something that you do regardless. This is done on the client, right? It's a provider, so it's a client component. Now, if you go here to the getQueryClient.ts file, where we actually have the getQueryClient function, we're doing something a bit different here because we now are on the server. Dominik, please correct me if, as I go through this, if I make any mistakes, because I don't work like on the day-to-day basis with all the server stuff. Again, more in React Native land. So I am familiar with this, but not an expert. So if I make any mistakes, just correct me. So then we have this make query client function here, which just returns an instance of the query client. And here we're passing some properties, some default options, just one of them, the stale time. And this is actually important. And we have a comment here that says why we're doing this. So because we're now on the server, we're essentially, as we're going to see in the code, we're going to be prefetching some data on the server, right? So in that first pass, when we actually get the data on the server, we're going to do that. But the React Query default behavior is to actually, on the client, whenever you instantiate a use query hook, it will actually fetch data initially, because that's just the default behavior. Putting stale time here is essentially going to prevent that for the amount of time that you have stale time, because that fetch is already done on the server. This is something that you don't have to do on the client, because on the client, there is no server, so that prefetching doesn't usually happen, at least in this case, in this situation. So that's why we put this stale time over here. Then we actually use that make query client function inside of this get query client. And here we're checking if we're on the server. And here, if we're on the server, we're just always going to return a new query client. And this, correct me if I'm wrong, Dominik, the reason we're doing this is because on the server, we have multiple users that might access the data. And if we have the same query client, it would actually share the data and share the cache with all the users, which we don't want, correct?
Exactly. On the server, we usually want to be scoped to a single request. And there is I think an experimental cache function that I think it's also in the docs that we could use to wrap it around to basically always get in at the same query client. But it's usually not necessary on the server unless we want to do the same prefetches in different components and basically reuse the query cache. But I think Next.js deduplicates fetch calls on the server anyways, or at least they used to do that. They have their own caching system. So creating a new query client on the server every time when you want to invoke a query client is not a problem. But if we only have like one instance that's created on the server and we have a long-running server, then this query client could actually contain data from different requests and therefore from different users. So that might be problematic, and it's the safe thing to do is to always create a new one on the server.
Fair enough. Cool. And then on the client, we're just creating a new client every single time. In the docs, you have a comment relating this to suspense. I initially thought that the reason why we're doing this is because we just need one client on the client per like individual instance of a client. But you mentioned something that you don't need to do this if you have a suspense below this. Yeah. Can you explain a bit about that?
So it's actually Next.js related. So if we take a look at the normal server rendering guide, what we do is we create one query client in a use state or an instance ref inside the provider's component.
Yes.
So this also makes sure that you only have one client for the lifetime of your application.
Yes.
But what React, actually it's React and Next.js related. What React does is when your component unmounts, because of a suspense boundary, and then it remounts, obviously the state is gone. So what you would want to do is you would want to create this state that holds the query client at the very, very top of your application. And then if you have suspense boundaries below that, it doesn't matter because it never unmounts. However, Next.js actually doesn't give us a way to create a suspense boundary between our first top level component that we have and the state that we create inside of it, if we are using a loading.tsx file or loading.jsx file. If we have a loading.jsx file at the very top of our root layout, the whole component will unmount and remount because it actually adds a suspense boundary above our top level component. And we actually, someone contributed this and found this out because we were seeing some very weird behavior of infinite refetches going on, because what happened was that the client was created in state. We wanted to fetch some data. The suspense actually unmounted the component that holds the query client. The promise resolves. We mount the component again. We recreate the query client. The client holds the cache, so the data is gone. The component mounts. It tries to fetch again. It resuspends, and we kind of get in an infinite loop with that. So that was actually very hard to find out why this is happening. And this get query client function works around this problem by not holding the instance in use state at the top level React component. That's basically a singleton, right? Here we're using an actual singleton by doing it on the, propagating it to a browser query client that we're storing in the closure only on the browser, because on the server we really don't want that.
Okay, cool. No, that's thank you for that. That's very enlightening. Cool. So that's what essentially this function does. At the end of it, you just get a query client no matter where you are. So now we're going to then go to the page, the posts page server component. So this is where things are just a little bit different on the server. So here we are in a server component. We have the post page here. It is an asynchronous function. We're getting the query client here, which is going to be the server, always a new instance of a query client on the server through the function. And then we are prefetching the posts query using the query function getPosts. And then we have this very interesting hydration boundary component, which takes in a state prop, and we're passing dehydrate query client to that. I'll let you speak to that in just a moment, Dominik. I just want to then go and move on to the posts client component. So this is the client component that we're actually rendering, the post client component. And this one is identical to a normal React query client component, everything that you would do on the client without even the server. So we're using React query as usual. We have the data, we have the query key over here, and then we're rendering the data there. What is important here is that now this data has been prefetched on the server, and so it will be available in this client component because it's been prefetched on the server. Now, the question is, Dominik, how does that happen, right? We have this hydration boundary component here, which I would assume is the thing that drives this entire thing. But can you just talk a bit and give your insights as to how this actually is working?
Yeah. So when we do prefetching with the query client, the query function is called, in this case, getPosts, and the post data winds up after this await prefetch query. The query client has this post data. But the query client is kind of like a class, and it now lives on the server in this post page server component. And now we need to get it to the client. And what the hydration boundary does, first of all, the dehydrate query client basically takes the query client class and creates like a serializable object out of it. So it contains the query keys, the query hashes, the data, some meta information about the query, like things that we would like to send from the server to the client. And what the hydration boundary then does is it takes that thing and it basically just like you would do, I think, we did the same thing really with in the pages directory with, what was the function called? Get server-side props or something, where we would also use the same mechanism. It basically takes this and sends it to, serializes it to the client, right? And the important part is what happens there, basically, right? Because the client in the browser, that data will be sent to the browser, but there we actually need to pick it up. And the hydration boundary does the same thing on the client. When this component renders on the client, it takes that data and puts it in the cache on the client, so that the post component that lives below it would actually be able to instantly read the data from the cache.
Very interesting. So if I got this right, this hydration boundary takes the state that we prefetched, which is going to be this prefetch query, but also it will include all the state of the query client, correct? Even other things that have been maybe prefetched, right?
Yes. And this is also one of the reasons why we would prefer to have this get query client return a new query client every time, because otherwise, if you have multiple hydration boundaries in your application, different components, you would actually send the same data twice, or you would send more data than you need to. We have some plans of maybe creating a dehydrate new function where we can kind of like see which data has already been sent to the client and which data has not yet been sent. And then we would basically allow reusing a query client across multiple server components. But there are just some little trade-offs that usually it probably won't matter even if you reuse a query client on the server. But just to be aware that this exists. Yeah.
Okay. So then that data, then inside of this hydration boundary, goes from the server, and then the code inside of the hydration boundary does a bunch of code, and then it puts it in the query client on the actual client, which this use query here is going to have access to on the client. So kind of this hydration boundary is like the bridge between the server and the client, and it just does everything by giving this as a prop. Cool. That's really cool. Yeah. So then if we go to the posts here on the client, is there anything different in this component only? So let's say you're like a developer and you've never worked on server components, you don't even know what they are, and you come here and you look at this post client component. Is there anything different now that we're doing something on the server that we need to kind of be aware about, or is it just completely the same?
I would say it's not really any different once you are in a client component, because for use query, it doesn't matter if data is in the cache already or if there's no data in the cache, right? It's meant to behave isomorphically, so it can return you data, it can return you stale data and do a refetch, it can return fresh data and not refetch at all, or it can say there's nothing in there but you want the data, so I'm going to get it for you. That's what the key and the function and the other options that we have provide for us. Now, there are many ways to get data into the cache. We can do prefetching in a client component when we hover a link, right before we go to a page. We can do this with route loaders in React Router or TanStack Router. You can also pre-fill the cache in a route loader. You can restore data from local storage and put it in the cache on the client before the application loads. If you have data, or we have a plugin for that, so that you can basically sync and read and write from local storage. Or you can do it on the server, right? So this hydration mechanism, it's the same thing we use for reading and writing from local storage. It's really the same logic, the same function even. So the client component doesn't care if there's data in the cache. Data might be in the cache because you prefetch it on the server. It might not be on the cache. It might not be in the cache from the server. And then it will just do what it does, give you data or fetch it.
Right. So then to kind of put this simply, what we're doing here in this server post page component is we're just handling this new environment that we can now put data in and fetch data in, right? And we just created, we're just using these components and like the dehydrate function and whatnot to just kind of fill that environment with our data because we can. And it would be the same as exactly we're doing it before clicking a link on hover or any other example. It's just the actual implementation that's different because the environment itself is different. Interesting.
Yeah, and there's also one thing that you might actually want to have a different query function on the server and on the client if that's necessary, because on the client, you have to make a fetch to an API endpoint, right? On the server, you can also do that, but you are on the server. Maybe you don't want to do it, right? Maybe you want to call like your database function directly in the query function that gives you the posts. And you would basically just do that in the prefetch query. You can say in the prefetch query where we also pass the query function, you could make a direct database read if you want to.
Right.
So there are situations where you'd want that. There are some situations where you just want the same options. This is dependent on what you prefer or what the use case is.
If you have like a different function, would it have to return like the same data, or would you be able to get by with different data? Like if you're doing it through the database directly, let's say.
It should have the same structure.
Okay. So,
because that data is then what gets dehydrated and put into the client. And if you are expecting a different structure on the client than what the server puts in, then yeah, it doesn't match. That's why, of course, it's likely a good idea. If you have the same function, you can't get this wrong, right? But I think calling an API endpoint on the server might even have an overhead if you're actually making a fetch request to the server, like from the server to the server. Maybe you have split this up into a function where, sorry, maybe you've split this up into a function where you have an API endpoint, and that basically just calls a function that reads from the database, and you would call that function directly without doing the API endpoint in the prefetching on the server or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So kind of, you mentioned a bit, your talk is going to be on the bad things about React Query. Any potential negatives or things to watch out using this approach? I have two in mind, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
You have two in mind. Oh, interesting. Okay, now I need to.
They're from your docs, man. They're from the docs. So.
Okay. This is actually Frederick wrote, another maintainer wrote the docs. He's like very deep into server components and server-side rendering. So he probably knows more about this than I do. So yeah, what are the two things that you have?
Fair enough. So the first one is kind of a waterfall, like the server waterfall. So the way we currently have it set up, we haven't looked at this comments server component, but if I just go and open it, it's the same thing as the posts. We're just getting the query client again. We're prefetching, and this time we're just prefetching the comments, and we have the same hydration boundary, same function, and we have the same or similar client-side component. What happens here, the way we currently have this set up, is that the comments server component actually has to wait for the post prefetch query to happen because we're using a wait. So we kind of have a waterfall, right? In the docs, it's stated this, and it's stating also that sometimes if the latency is like small enough, it's not really a problem, which it isn't. And that you also can, in the case of like Next.js, for example, you can fix this with like parallel routes or like... I believe there was maybe another way. Can you just maybe talk a bit about that if you have something to add?
Yeah, so waterfalls are often a problem. Waterfalls are more a problem on the client than on the server, but they still exist on the server as well. You would have the same problem if you would take like a standard example from server components where you basically have like a wait database.get or whatever, where you're basically in the server component reading asynchronous data and then rendering a child component that doesn't necessarily depend on the data, right? But that also does its own asynchronous operation. So every time you do a wait, you're actually blocking, and parallel routes are a way to solve this problem. Another thing that you can do in Next.js and also in React Query is to send promises from the server to the client. So technically, you don't need to await that prefetch query call. You can just call prefetch query without awaiting it. That doesn't put data into the cache, but it puts the promise in the cache, right? So at this point, the promise would be in the cache. I think this is a bit further down in the advanced server guide, because per default, we only dehydrate successful queries, so only queries that have data. This is the default value that we've had, because, up until, I don't know, half a year ago, it wasn't possible to send promises from the server to the client. How this technically works in Next.js is still a bit of a mystery to me, but it works. So now we have to widen our dehydration function and customize it a little bit to tell it, if we have a pending query, like a query that has a promise but isn't yet resolved, we can also send that to the client. And what happens then is that the hydration boundary sends the promise from the server to the client. And on the client, the hydration boundary or the hydrate component has a special mechanism. If it sees a promise, it just picks it up and puts it in the query cache as well. And we would then await this promise on the client at the point in time when you call use query. So in that situation, it would be awaited in the post component. But the post component is a sibling to the comment server to the comments component. So if we'd use this mechanism, we would get rid of the waterfall.
Okay, cool. And then the second thing, this is not so much of a problem of this setup the way that we have it, but it's something that might be easy to kind of overlook. And it's also in the docs. If you, instead of prefetch the query, if you actually fetch the query because you say you want to access the data inside of the server component and you actually use it in the JSX, you are going to get the data is going to be out of sync, because then on the client, that data is going to update. But on the server side, there's no concept of like re-updating or revalidating data. And so that would be like a risk to get it out of sync. And I mention it because, it's simple to be like, oh, let's just fetch the query, let's put it here. But you're forgetting that this is a different environment and it's going to be out of sync. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
It can get out of sync if you're basically, what you want to do with prefetching is you take the data and then you hand it over to React Query. On the client, at that point, React Query handles the revalidation. There's this window focus refetching. There are different refetching mechanisms. Maybe you have a refetch interval, and then we'll always call your get post function and display that data in the client component, or like in that part of the tree where you are then rendering it on the client. But the server component will not revalidate unless you actually revalidate the route from Next.js. So in this situation, if you just send that data with fetch query and you get access to the data and you render it on the server, and then you also give it to React Query on the client, that those are very likely to get out of sync depending on your state time settings, however this is customized. So this is why we are actually documenting that it's the better thing to do to just use prefetching, because prefetch query purposefully doesn't return any data. It just puts the data in the query cache. You can still call query client.get query data to get it out of there, but it's really something that we do not recommend because of this issue that things on the server are probably lasting longer than the synchronization we do on the client.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool. Thanks for your input on that. A question I have is, we could also achieve the same thing with passing initial data to the client use query, right? It accepts an initial data prop, and we can get that from the server as well. Can you talk a bit about maybe the differences? Are they the same? Should we use one over the other?
So they're not the same. Initial data is a bit easier to set up, maybe because you would just need to call like await get posts on the server. Then you have the data, and then you can pass that data down to your posts component and then put it in there as initial data on the client. So I think it doesn't work with promises. So if you want like the promises streaming down approach, you would need the dehydrate of the whole query client to make that work. But the other thing that's important to know is that initial data only does something. It only puts data in the cache if there is no other data in the cache. It's meant as a fallback, like as an initial data, right? Yeah. It's the first thing that goes into the cache. So this will work quite well on the first render of the server component. But then imagine you're navigating away from this site and then you're navigating back to it, right? If you're navigating back to it, the server components tree will re-render, revalidate, whatever, re-execute. You will fetch those posts on the server again. You will send them down to the client. You will wait for them on the server even, right? So you might wait those couple hundred milliseconds until that data is there. And then on the client, you will pass it to use query as initial data. And use query will say, well, I already have data. I don't need that. And it would just throw it away. So at this point, you have basically fetched something on the server and waited for it. And it's probably a more accurate representation of what you have in the cache because it's newer, right? But it doesn't do anything. And what the dehydrate function does, and the hydration boundary, is it will always overwrite data into the cache if that data is newer than the data that you have in the cache. If for some reason, you have cache data in your server component, because you are using like this new use cache directive maybe, or there's some other caching that you have on the server, and the server component re-executes and gives you data that's older than what you have on the client already, it will also like disregard that. But usually when the server component reevaluates, the data you have in the query client on the server will have newer data than what your client has. And then the hydration boundary will send that data down, and the client will actually update itself in the browser. It will use it. So while the initial data approach is probably a little bit easier to set up, it's not something that I would use if I expect users to navigate around a lot, or if these server components are reevaluating a lot. The server components are static and maybe even cached, right? Maybe at build time, then this isn't a problem. Then we can definitely do that. But otherwise, the dehydrate function and the hydration boundary are a lot more powerful in that regard.
And safe as well, right? Because it's easier to shoot yourself in the foot. Okay, interesting. Good to know. Cool. And then kind of getting to the wrapping up stage a bit, I'm very curious. So React Query, right? It's a client-side library, right? It's mostly for that. Where do you see it having a place in like server components? Because it kind of feels like, like, do we even need like React Query in the server? Because we could do all of this without React Query, and maybe like, where would it make sense still to have React Query even when we have server components and server functionality?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, so I've written a blog post about it. Naturally,
okay.
It's called "You Might Not Need React Query," and it goes into the things that's a bit clickbaity title maybe, but it goes into the notion that if you're starting like a new greenfield project and you want to use a mature framework that has data fetching and mutations and everything built in, and it works well for you, then there might not be a need to use React Query, right? It has a very good purpose for client-side data fetching, if that's what you do. But if you have server components, or if you're using Remix and you have loaders and they have great support for all the things that you need, I'm not going to tell you to use React Query like just because I maintain it, right? It's just it should really solve a problem that you have, and it should fit the use case that you're having. But I still see that there can be like a lot of benefits to it if you are building client-side rich interactive applications with Next.js. It's a thing that a lot of people want, is to be able to get a fast rendering on the initial page load with server components, and then basically hand everything over for like an interactive dashboard component, or maybe an infinite scrolling list that needs to refetch on and on, or maybe something where you want to work with real-time data and WebSockets, and you're basically consuming third-party events that you want to render on your screen. So all of these little interactive things, keeping your screen more up to date than a navigation would, right? Because with Next.js, the screen only re-executes, or the server components mostly only revalidate if you do it programmatically or if the user navigates around. But there are situations where you would want that to be more fine-grained, and React Query gives you the tools to do that.
I really like how you said more up to date than a navigation would. That's spot on, and I think that's exactly the question you want to ask yourself when you want to use React Query or not, is do I need this to be up to date more than a navigation would? Really nice, well said. And then I guess my last question, kind of piggybacking off of that, is how do you feel about the future of React Query, and like any general thoughts about where you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, I generally feel very good about it because right now we are, with the TanStack team, we're working on TanStack Router and TanStack Start, which is the new framework built on the router, and Query plays an important role in that whole setup to kind of like smoothen the integration between the server and the client. There are lots of things we are exploring. There's also always React Native, where React Query is, like you mentioned initially, is used a lot. And there are still like the things that we're discussing with server components. I still feel like that this is like the very edge of things. They've been around for 1 year or longer than 1 year. Yeah. But still, if you look at the industry, people that are not on Twitter on the very edge, or go to conferences, right? You have a very long tail of users that just build spas, right? I think there's some good simplicity to building a Vite-based single page application. Maybe with React Query and React Router or TanStack Router. So I still think that there's a place for it, even if it's like not very tightly integrated with what you would do on the server. And there are definitely some cases where people will not use it, but I don't see it going away or something anytime soon.
Good. Good. So for anyone that's like afraid, or you love React Query and you're afraid of seeing it going, it's not going anywhere. It's staying. You just have to be smart and really understand where it makes sense to use it and where it makes sense not to use it, and just make educated decisions based off of that, which is kind of was hopefully the point of this video. Cool. Any kind of last remarks that you want to add, Dominik? Maybe something for the audience that you think they should know, or it's okay if you have nothing as well. It's fine. I'll leave it up to you.
No, I'm really looking forward to React Day Berlin on the 13th of December. Gonna be great to connect with people who are there. Really looking forward to it, and yeah, hopefully I can see many of the viewers and listeners there too.
Cool, perfect. So thank you so much, Dominik. It's been really wonderful. Thank you for giving your time to this. Once again, you'll be able to find Dominik's talk at the React Day Berlin conference. There's a link in the description. And if you also want to come meet me in person as well, that's your chance to do it again. And very excited to seeing and hearing your talk at the conference, Dominik. And thank you once again for doing this video.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Cool.